Welcome to the Living Loud and Proud podcast, brought to you by Disability Pride, Pennsylvania. If you need a link to the transcript for this episode, please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org/podcast. And now, here is your host. Hey folks, welcome to the Living Loud and Proud podcast. I'm your host and producer, Phill Rosen, and today's episode is From Independence to Inclusion, America's Disability Rights Greatest Hits. So it is July 2026 when this episode is being put out there for consumption, and earlier this month was the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, and I thought, what a perfect time to talk about all the different things that have happened over the last 250 years of our nation's history. This also happens to be a month when, there are a number of pretty big things that have happened in disability history, moving the needle forward in terms of equity and inclusion for the disability community. So even more perfect that I get to talk about it in this month, July. So, first things first, I just want to throw out there that I am going to be not talking about the entire history of disability history throughout this country's existence. First of all, there's a lot of stuff that I don't need to tell anyone in the disability community that is a little bit upsetting for a lot of people who are disabled. So we're really not going to be talking about any of that stuff. And, here at Disability Pride and on this podcast, we really want to focus on the more positive things that have moved towards greater equity, inclusion, independence, what have you, for the disability community. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I just want to address that because I am going to be talking about disability history and the language has changed a lot, even the last decade, when it comes to the way that we talk about disabilities and the disability community, that I am going to be using some anachronistic language, some terms that are definitely outdated. I'm not going to go too far in terms of anything like things that might be considered slurs. None of that is in this episode, but for anyone who doesn't want to hear terms that are outdated, you can skip this episode. With that out of the way, let me get started with the first thing. And actually, we're going all the way back to the beginning of this nation's founding, 1776, 250 years ago. So following the Revolutionary War, servicemen who had significant injuries or were unable to provide for their household were financially supported by the first pension law enacted by the Continental Congress on August 26, 1776 at the Pennsylvania State House, which is now Independence Hall, right here in Philly. This law stipulated half pay for life or during disability, extending to every officer, soldier, or sailor losing a limb in any engagement or being so disabled in the service of the United States as to render him incapable of earning a living. Proportionate relief has also been approved through this law for partially disabled servicemen. One of the major weaknesses of this law was that it relied upon the individual colonies and eventually the states to fund pensions independently until after the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And right after the U.S. Constitution was ratified in March of 1792, the Invalid Pensions Act provided the first framework to really fund the pensions out of the newly formed U.S. National Treasury, which provided for federal funding. So, as you can see, there has been this recognition that we need to support the disability community, even since back then. Of course, this was due to veterans who were injured. So that is an important, I think, context in sort of the way that we think about disability or have thought about disability historically in this country. So just something interesting to note there. And now we're going to jump forward to 1817. And in Hartford, Connecticut, the American School for the Deaf was founded. This was the first school for children with disabilities in the Western Hemisphere. And, this is the first of many things that we talk about regarding schools. Now we're jumping ahead to 1864, and Congress authorized the Columbia Institution for the Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb and the Blind to confer college degrees. Lincoln signed this act into law. Edward Minor Gallaudet was made president of the entire corporation, including the college, and that might give some hints as to where we're going here. First college established for people with disabilities in the world. It's now known as Gallaudet University, and it's a private, federally chartered university for the education of the deaf and hard of hearing. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1880, and America's National Association of the Deaf was established. And we're just going to breeze through a few more here. 1908 and 1909, Clifford Whittingham Beers founded the Connecticut Society for Mental Hygiene. It's now Mental Health Connecticut. And in 1909, Clifford Whittingham Beers founded the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, now Mental Health America. Both of these organizations pioneered treatment reform of mental illnesses, leading to the eventual closure of abusive mental hospitals across the U.S. This is really kind of important because Beers was institutionalized for depression and paranoia earlier in the century in 1900. And these organizations were born out of his experiences because he felt really abused and he wanted to avoid that for everyone else who might be having mental health issues. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1918, and the Smith-Sears Veterans Rehabilitation Act becomes law, providing the promotion of vocational rehabilitation and return to civil employment of disabled persons discharged from the U.S. military following World War I. Again, another law that really kind of exemplifies the way that we have historically thought about who we should be taking care of in this country, and where we find the resources when it comes to the disability community. Of course, starts with the disabled veterans. Over time, this has been expanded, thankfully, and we will get into that fairly shortly. We're going to jump ahead to 1931, and the Pratt-Smoot Act passes Congress and is signed into law by Herbert Hoover. One of the few things that he did during his presidency that I think could be considered universally positive development. This law provided $100,000 administered by the Library of Congress to establish the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. The program, Books for the Blind, has been heavily amended and expanded over the years and still provides blind and low vision Americans with both analog and digital recordings of books, publications, and music materials. This is, of course, run through the Library of Congress. So, this is something that has helped to expand access to materials for all sorts of people with disabilities. And now we're going to jump ahead a couple of years to 1933. And, I didn't want to necessarily focus on Franklin D. Roosevelt's well-documented disability, but because he became president, the White House started renovations in 1933 to become one of the first wheelchair-accessible government buildings in D.C. These modifications were made during FDR's presidency to accommodate his disability. Upgrades included an indoor pool for exercise, interior elevators, and there was a relocation of the Oval Office in the southeast corner of the West Wing to reduce the barriers from the living quarters, between the living quarters and the West Wing, and shorten transit routes, interior elevators, and ramps. So this is a big deal because, obviously, FDR had been left disabled due to an illness. And this is the beginning, I think, of starting to see disability as something that could be talked about outside of the realm of taking care of veterans that were disabled in war. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1935, and the League of the Physically Handicapped in New York City is organized in May of this year. The League's central goal was to end discrimination by the Works Progress Administration, part of the New Deal, against physically disabled unemployed workers. The Home Relief Bureau of the city coded disabled applicants as PH for physically handicapped. Disabled workers weren't hired by the WPA, leading to 2 sit-ins in 1935. Following public pressure, the WPA created 1,500 jobs for physically disabled workers in New York City. And this is, I think, very important to talk about because this is a moment in history where we saw protests that led to positive outcomes for disabled workers and for the disability community writ large. And there's going to be a lot of talk about this, and it just shows that if you put enough pressure as a collective, sometimes you get some things that you wanted. And now we're going to move forward another year to 1936, which is the Randolph-Shepard Act passing. This law mandates a priority to blind persons operate vending facilities on federal property. It was amended and updated significantly in 1974. Now there are about 2,500 blind vendors operating throughout the United States, managing businesses running the gamut of food service and vending machines, snack bars, gift shops, highway rest stop, vending operation, and major food service operations through military dining contracts. Now, I understand why some people might not agree with me as to this being per se an important thing to talk about, but I think it's really important because it shows that there can be a positive move to try and help financially support people by providing them with the ability to get contracts through the government. And so when it comes to the disabled community, this is one thing that can lead to people being more independent, of course. So we're going to jump ahead a few years now to the 1940s, and Kalamazoo, Michigan installs curb cuts as a pilot project to aid the employment of disabled veterans throughout their city. This is definitely important because this is the beginning of understanding that the built environment needs to change so that people can be better accommodated to get to and from work as well as just to live their life. And now there's a few things that happened in 1940 that were important that I want to talk about. In 1940, the National Federation of the Blind was formed in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania by Jacobus Brooke and others. The organization advocated for white cane laws and input by blind people for programs for blind clients and other reforms. So this is important because this is a blind-led organization, and was founded by blind people. And also in 1940, the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped is founded by Paul Strachan. It was the first cross-disability national political organization to urge ending job discrimination, lobby passage of related legislation, and call for a national Employ the Physically Handicapped Week, amongst other initiatives. And later on, in 1945, Public Law 176, also known as the Armed Forces Voluntary Recruitment Act, is signed into law by President Harry Truman, officially codifying National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week as the first week of October in the U.S., and eventually the week would be extended into the entire month of October. The reason I wanted to talk about Public Law 176 is because there are a lot of different states and cities and other governments throughout the U.S. that have started to, over the years, use the month of October as a disability awareness month of some sort, whether it's through education or other things. And I think it really does come down to the fact that, National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week becoming an extension into an entire month is probably a big reason for that. So I just wanted to mention that. And we're going to jump ahead to the 1960s. 1962, Edward Roberts successfully sued to gain admission to the University of California, Berkeley, becoming the first student with significant disabilities to attend the school. And Edward Roberts, I could actually have an entire episode just talking about him and all the different things that he has done over the years, that he was advocating for disability rights. And, a lot of it has to do with, University of California, Berkeley, but also, you see him get talked about again and again throughout disability rights actions throughout the years. So at some point we'll probably have a longer discussion about him, but this was the first moment where someone with significant disabilities being able to attend schools in the University of California system. So that's a big deal. And in 1963, 1 year later, JFK called for a reduction over a number of years and by the hundreds of thousands in the number of persons confined to residential institutions, and asked that methods be found to, quote, retain in and return to the community the mentally ill, and there to restore and revitalize their lives through better health programs and strengthened educational and rehabilitation services. This call to action, further led to the deinstitutionalization of mentally, of patients in mental health institutions, as well as, disabled people broadly, and increase the community services nationwide. And I do think that without this discussion, that it would have been more of an uphill battle for Lyndon Baines Johnson to put forth a lot of his great society reforms, which we're about to talk about right here. In 1965, as we've talked about in the past on this podcast, Medicare and Medicaid are established through the passage of the Social Security Amendments of 1965. This provided federally subsidized health care to disabled and elderly Americans covered by the Social Security program. These amendments also changed the definition of disability under the Social Security Disability Program from, quote, of long and continued indefinite duration to, quote, expected to not last less than 12 months. And, this is important, of course, because this was an expansion of, a lot of the Social Security program that was created during the 1930s in the New Deal. And so the Great Society ended up creating a lot of different things for the disability community and just society at large. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Also in 1965, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf is established by Congress at Rochester Institute of Technology. And Rochester Institute of Technology is known as another institution that is important for supporting deaf people. I know that, it's something that I knew about back when I was in school, back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, in Ithaca, New York. So it is well known, at least throughout New York State. And I actually, if I remember correctly, the part of the reason I knew about this was because there was a physical therapy program that, it was like a 7-year program, and you got both your undergrad and your master's degree, I believe, in PT through Ithaca College, and you spent like a couple of semesters in Rochester at, I want to say, RIT. Maybe it was Rochester University. I'm not sure. But there was talk about that, and certainly it was something that a lot of PT students would make a concerted effort to try and learn sign language while they were in Rochester, because it would help them to be better physical therapists and help their patients. So just a little anecdote there. And then in 1965, also, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is signed into law by LBJ. This provides sweeping protections for minority voting rights, as well as allowing disabled voters to receive assistance by a person of the voter's choice, so long as it wasn't the voter's boss or union agent. I think it's pretty obvious why you wouldn't want someone's boss or their union rep or other agent to have a hand in assisting someone to vote. So this hopefully creates an unbiased agent to assist someone in voting who needs it. So we're going to jump forward to 1970, and this is when Disabled in Action was founded. There was a number of people who founded it. Judy Heumann is a notable one. Other friends of Judy's who founded the organization include Denise McQuaid, Bobby Lynn, Frida Tankus, and of course there are others. And over the many years of the organization's existence, members have advocated for disabled individuals' rights. Some small examples of advocacy work include Disabled in Action of Pennsylvania Incorporated v. Coleman, which was known as the Transbus lawsuit. This decision, of course, requires that all buses purchased by public transit authorities, receiving federal funds meet Transbus specifications to be wheelchair accessible. Really, really important, because for a very long time here in the U.S. and around the world, public transit has not been wheelchair accessible and otherwise accessible to disabled individuals. Another example of advocacy includes picketing the United Cerebral Palsy Telethon, which was also in 1976. And, the reason for picketing the United Cerebral Palsy Telethon, of course, is to talk about the fact that these types of telethons don't really help the disability community move forward in any way, and really just inspire pity. And I don't really want to talk too much about this, but there is a notion of inspiration porn, and a lot of these telethons historically have been used as a way of uplifting disabled people in a way that isn't necessarily on the disabled individual's terms. So, not necessarily a fan of telethons here. I know, hot take, but just wanted to throw that out there. And of course, the last thing I want to talk about as another example of advocacy work includes the settling with Duane Reade drugstores to make all of their stores ADA compliant on April 19th of 2006. Now, for those of you who are not in the New York City area, Duane Reade is a chain of drugstores throughout New York City. We're going to move forward to 1972, and there's a couple of things that I want to talk about that happened in 1972. First, an early version of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was vetoed by Nixon in October. Now, obviously, this is not something that was necessarily positive for the disability rights movement. However, in November 3rd of this year, Disabled in Action staged a protest of Nixon's veto. 80 activists staged a sit-in on Madison Avenue, blocking traffic, along with protests in D.C. This put pressure on lawmakers to continue negotiations, culminating in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 passing, including Section 504. And of course, this is again another example of how if you put pressure in the right way, you can often get elected officials to actually do things that are positive for you and your community. And of course, in early 1973, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 passes and is later enacted in September. This becomes the first law nationwide to define employment discrimination against disabled employees, as well as to codify rules accommodating disabled individuals in educational settings through Section 504. This is not the end of us talking about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but that's a real quick sort of overview of it. 1975, Gerald Ford signs the Education for All Handicapped Children Act into law. This act stipulates all schools receiving federal funding are required to evaluate children with disabilities and create an educational program that emulates the experience of non-disabled students as closely as possible. This act is an amendment to Part B of the Education of the Handicapped Act, which was enacted in 1966. I know that I skipped over that earlier, but I think this is a little more relevant. An additional provision in the EACHA requires school districts to provide an administrative process for parents to dispute decisions made about their child's education. What's really important about this is at the time, the only recourse for parents of disabled children to be able to dispute decisions meant that they had to go through the court. They had to sue the school district or the administration. And unfortunately, because of the way that our legal system is set up, this favors wealthier individuals and institutions. And many families did not have the resources to be able to sue. So unfortunately, this means that they did not, in fact, have a way to be able to dispute these things effectively. So, about a decade later, this law requires that there be a separate administrative process through the school. And at the end of that process, once you've exhausted all of those avenues as a parent, you can then potentially use the court system if the school is still not being satisfactory with the way in which they're addressing your concerns. All right. Now, let's go to 1977. And for those of you who know anything about Section 504 and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, you probably know where we're going with this. But in 1977, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare Joseph Califano refused to sign meaningful regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And this led to the 504 sit-ins happening nationwide. The longest lasting demonstration was at the San Francisco office of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. We've talked a little bit about this in the past on this podcast as well. But this sit-in lasted a total of 28 days with more than 150 people protesting. One of the notable protesters was Brad Lomax. And those of you who are from Philly and know a little bit about the history of activism in the city and the U.S. in general probably know that name. But he was a protester in the building, and this led to the Black Panther Party supporting the protest, supplying hot meals to everyone inside the building, and generally supporting outside the building the protests as well. And so this sit-in went from April 5th all the way into May. Joseph Califano signed the regulations on April 28th, 1977. So, again, another example of taking action and things moving forward in a positive direction for society and the disability community at large. All right, we're going to go to 1978. And on July 5th and 6th of 1978, the Gang of 19 blocked buses at an intersection in Denver, Colorado, chanting, "We will ride." Later in the year, the Denver Regional Transit Authority agreed to make the public transit system wheelchair accessible due to a continued pressure campaign of civil disobedience in Denver. This is important because the Gang of 19 was, had ties to, I believe it was the Atlantis living community in Denver. And anyone who knows a little bit about that knows that Wade Blank was an advocate that helped to create that community. So this is another big thing that happened and helped to move public transit in the right direction across the country. in its way. And I went to Denver a few years ago, and there actually is a plaque still outside of the State House talking about the Gang of 19 and what that meant for public transit in the city of Denver. So it's still something that we remember today as a big leap forward for disability rights again. Also in 1978, Title VII of the Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1978 became law in the U.S., which established the first federal funding for consumer-controlled independent living centers nationwide. So in 1980, I just want to mention this real quick, the American National Standard Institute Incorporated published American Standard Specifications for making buildings accessible to and usable by the physically handicapped, which is the A117.1 barrier-free standard. Well, why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Well, this document eventually became the basis for subsequent architectural access codes, which were outlined in the future Americans with Disabilities Act. Oh, we're going to get there, folks, but just give me a little bit of time. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1983, and ADAPT was established in Denver. Since its inception, ADAPT has participated in actions to advocate for disability rights. At first, they focused on public transit. And so some notable actions include protesting inaccessible Greyhound buses in 1988, the Capitol Crawl of 1990, the healthcare protests in 2018, and disrupting a House Energy and Commerce meeting in 2025 to protest the One Big Beautiful Bill provisions that cut Medicare and Medicaid significantly over the next, 4 years, I think? 3 years, maybe? Point is, ADAPT, of course, started out at, like I said, focused on public transit and has now moved on from public transit focused, from a public transit focus to helping individuals have more ability to live in the community, to have independence, so on and so forth. So, this is definitely important. In 1988, we're going to move ahead, the original version of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is introduced into Congress. The final version of the law, of course, wouldn't be signed until July 26th of 1990. And there was a lot of, hemming and hawing. There was a lot of delaying. And overall, a lot of hostility to the idea of requiring businesses to be accessible to individuals with wheelchairs and other disabilities. So we're going to jump ahead a couple years to 1990. And on March 12th, the Wheels of Justice March and the Capitol Crawl occur. So the Wheels of Justice March involved over 1,000 activists marching from the White House to the U.S. Capitol building. This was organized in part by ADAPT, I believe. And about 60 activists cast aside their mobility aids and crawled up the 83 steps in front of the building to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've actually talked about the Capitol Crawl on this podcast before. But, this was another action highlighting the social, societal, and architectural barriers that inaccessible buildings present to many members of society, and in general just move the needle forward on creating an accessible society that helps foster greater independence for disabled individuals. Now, also in 1990, June 4th is the day the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was reauthorized and renamed into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA Act. Oh man, that's so much nicer over the years. This reauthorization included a provision to permanently authorize a grant program providing federal funding to the states. All states receiving these funds are required to provide a free, appropriate public education to all children with disabilities in the least restrictive environment. Again, just another law that helps to provide for greater independence and for greater support of the disability community overall. And I also think, personally, that this was really the beginning of reintegrating or integrating classrooms as much as possible with individuals with disabilities, so that there weren't separations between disabled students and their peers. And I think this has led to a greater not only understanding of disability, but also understanding that we do need to help provide support to knock down barriers for disabled individuals. I think it's changed at least a significant portion of of younger generations' view on disabilities as well. So I think this is just again a positive step, massive leap in the right direction in society. As we mentioned earlier in this episode, the ADA was passed and signed into law by George H.W. Bush on July 26, 1990. A few days from today will be the 36th anniversary of this law being signed. This law is closely modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This expands the scope of access in society. Now, the ADA mandates that local, state, and federal governments and programs must be accessible. Employers with greater than 15 employees must make reasonable accommodations for workers with disabilities and otherwise not discriminate against qualified workers with disabilities. And public accommodations also must make reasonable modifications, to ensure access for disabled members of the public and provide disabled access toilet facilities if in private buildings, if bathrooms are provided in the building. And of course, the ADA also requires access in public transportation and communication. And it may sound a little silly to people that it requires access in public transportation. Really, what it did was, for any municipalities or states that had a public transit system receiving federal funding that wasn't accessible, they had to make accommodations and make modifications to the system to provide wheelchair accessibility and other accessibility modifications for people with blindness or who are deaf. All the different things that they can do to make it more accessible for the general public. So we're going to jump ahead a few years to 1993. Robert Williams was appointed the Commissioner of the Administration on Developmental Disabilities. Now, why is this important, you might ask? Well, he was the first developmentally disabled person named commissioner. So this is important because not only is it representation, but he is the first individual who had lived experience who was running the show. So, really big moment for everyone in that community. And then also in 1993, Jim Sinclair wrote the essay "Don't Mourn for Us." This essay has an anti-cure perspective on autism, and many consider it to be a touchstone of the fledgling, at the time, autism rights movement. And of course, that has become something that is, way bigger than than I think anyone ever really imagined it would be at this point now. So, excellent sort of moment there. In 1995, Justice for All was organized by Justin Dart Jr. and others in D.C. to advocate against calls to amend or repeal the ADA and IDEA Acts. Now, this is kind of important because I think this really underscores the fact that, yes, we have all of these different things that have been fought for and have been relentlessly advocated for, but there are always going to be those forces in society that want to take these things away. So another thing that happened in 1995 is the American Association of People with Disabilities was founded in DC. And, again, just another organization that helps to advocate for disability rights and advocate for and provide resources really for people to be able to live their lives a little bit more smoothly. Now we're going to jump ahead to 2004. And what happened in 2004 was the Assistive Technology Act of 2004 was passed and signed into law. And this act requires states to provide direct aid to individuals with disabilities, ensuring access to necessary technology. The majority of state efforts are required to be conducted in the following areas: assistive technology reutilization programs. So if someone has an old wheelchair and they decide to donate it to one of the AT Act offices throughout the 50 states, then that accessibility device will be refurbished and hopefully provided for people to use. Assistive technology demonstration programs. So this is like going out and showing people in the community, either at tabling events or otherwise, technologies that can be used to help people with disabilities live independently, and to provide like a little bit of a hands-on approach for people. Alternative financing programs. One such financing program that I can think of off the top of my head here in Pennsylvania is the Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation, and device loan programs. And so, this means that organizations that are funded in part through the Assistive Technology Act of 2004 are required to have on hand, all sorts of different accessibility devices. You can think of like all sorts of different things. I mean, like smart speakers, for instance, is a big one that I know of, at least here in Pennsylvania. You can ask to try one out for a few weeks, and they'll just send it out to you, and you can try it for a bit and whatnot. There's other things too, like certain different types of like lenses or things that would help people with visual impairments, all sorts of different things. And what's really cool about it is they literally it's all free. You just apply for whatever it is that you're looking for that's in their library, and then they'll send it to you and provide you with a return packing slip to then send it back when your loan is over. So this is really cool. It's like a free way for people to try out something that might be a little expensive. See if it really is something that would help them in their lives to live a easier life, more independent life. So there's that. We're going to jump ahead to 2006. And this is when the Combating Autism Act of 2006 passes and is signed into law by George W. Bush on December 19th. The law authorized nearly $1 billion in expenditures over 5 years, starting in 2007 for screening, education, early intervention, prompt referrals for treatment and services, and research of the autism spectrum disorders of autism and several similar conditions. We're going to jump ahead again to 2010. And this is when the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was signed into law by President Obama. This law stipulates that insurance companies cannot drop a person's coverage when they get sick due to a mistake the person has made on their application, or put an annual or lifetime cap on how much care they will pay for if a person gets sick. Insurers also cannot deny coverage based on pre-existing conditions. So what this really meant was that this allowed for people to a little bit more easily get insurance. There also were subsidies provided for through the law, which have now been getting cut. But at the end of the day, this allowed for more people to drop out of the coverage gap and really shrink it. And this, of course, is important for the disability community because, not everyone qualifies for Medicare or Medicaid. They're working, making too much money, or whatever. So this allowed for people who were making too much money but still needed to have health insurance to be able to get health insurance a little more affordably. And then later in 2011, March 15th, new ADA rules came into effect regarding service animals, and providing a clear definition for what is an acceptable service animal and providing a baseline for what services the animal provides to their handler. Now, when I say acceptable service animal, it doesn't necessarily define a species, but what it does is it really kind of more outlines what service animals do for disabled individuals, and these rules also provided for specific questions that can be asked of people with service animals to provide if there's a question going into a place of business or on a plane, what have you, anywhere that normally dogs might not be allowed. So that's or other animals, excuse me. But dogs tend to be what most people think of when they think of service animals. But I know that there are some people who have, I believe, service animals that are miniature ponies. So just to give an idea. And then in 2012, on July 28th, the first annual Disability Pride Philly Parade and celebration was held at the National Constitution Center in conjunction with the unveiling of Justin Jart Jr.'s wheelchair in the museum's permanent collection. At this celebration and presentation of the wheelchair, unveiling, whatever you want to call it. Yoshiko Dart, Justin's widow, spoke. And, over the years, Disability Pride Philly celebrations are held in various locations in Center City, primarily near City Hall, and now on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway near City Hall annually. Since 2012, there have been various updates to laws and regulations in many areas, including rule changes from the Department of Transportation regarding service animals on planes, an announcement of student debt cancellation for certain disabled individuals from the Department of Education, various ballot initiatives involving disabilities across several states, and laws extending civil rights protections to disabled persons, both federally and state by state and locally even. So I hope that this episode really kind of paints a picture for anyone out there that at the end of the day, we can go from thinking about advocating for disability rights and independence, and really thinking about it in the lens of talking only about veterans and people who've been disabled because they were injured in war. And we can, over time, through pressure and, just advocacy and education, we can move the needle in the right direction for everyone who is disabled or not to have a more independent life. And so I think that this episode really shows that, and really shows the ability of people to provide the right kinds of pressure over time and get the incremental wins over time to eventually get to a place where there's just so much more freedom, so much more, independence and ability to control one's destiny. And at the end of the day, it's important for us to remember that we are, if we support the disability community and being more independent, that uplifts everyone. So that's our show for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a good time until we release a new episode. See you then.
Please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org. You can find us on social media at Disability Pride PA on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.